Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. In recent years, the attention of the United States has turned so prominently to the Middle East that many feel other key regions, like Latin America, are in danger of being neglected. If so, it would not be the first time America has been charged with neglect of its hemispheric relations. But the costs of inattention might be much greater this time. For this is a season of change in Latin America, fueled by the aspirations of restless citizens bent on more responsive government, and led by a cadre of new leaders who seek to harness populist passion and direct its expression in ways that may define a new era in North-South relations. My guests are Andrew Selee, Director of the Mexico Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and Felipe Aguero, Professor in the Department of International Studies at the University of Miami and a current Fellow of the Wilson Center. Gentlemen, welcome to you both. I'm absolutely delighted to have this chance to talk with you because this really is a season of change. I think if you take the period from last November to the end of this year, something like 12 elections are being held in various countries of Latin America. And as you both know, in this country, there is interest, some might even say concern, about the direction that all of this taken collectively might be suggesting. So let's get started on looking at all these elections and the question of what it might suggest by looking at the countries you individually are very much interested and expert on. And with you, Felipe, that of course is Chile. And in fact, in Chile, we have an election, or have had one, that's brought a very interesting person to power, Michelle Bachelet, a woman who I think is the first woman elected in Latin America independent of her prior marital status. That is not
Correct.
The spouse of somebody. How's she doing?
She's doing fine. She's been in power for 2 months only. And she's been very busy trying to fulfill the promises that she made in the campaign. She was very specific in her campaign promises. 36 measures, in her first 100 days, and she's on to that. She's focused on some of those issues with more attention, such as the pension reform that she promised during her campaign, electoral reform that she also said that she would pay attention to, so that the system, which is the only part of the old authoritarian system that has not been reformed, may be reformed in a direction that may be more democratic.
How earth-shaking was her election, Felipe? I mean, not just the fact that she's a woman, but she's a very interesting individual. I understand, for example, she's an agnostic in a country that's strongly Catholic and that sort of thing. How groundbreaking is this?
Well, this is very important culturally for Chile to have someone that is an agnostic, although we have to bear in mind that President Lagos, who preceded her, was also an agnostic, also a socialist, also divorced and remarried. So, but of course these things come to light more forcefully with the fact that she's a woman, and that she's not married, and has 3 children from 2 different fathers. So it is different. And on the other hand, one has to say too that she's also continuity, because she is the leader of a coalition that has been in power ever since Pinochet was forced out of office in 1990. So there's change and continuity. But I think that the change elements are just starting. I think that the fact that she's there will mean that there will be more women, for instance, now in positions of leadership, not only in government, but also in the private sector.
Which
people
you study.
Will feel, people will feel that, well, we cannot have, just men sitting in these boards. If the president is a woman, if have the cabinet of women, and so on.
One other question before we turn to Mexico and get a sort of fix on what's going on there electorally. You mentioned the change and continuity, more change to be expected, but the continuity is very impressive. And what I mean by that, Felipe, is that, as you said, not just suggested, this is a country that's proceeded from the years of dictatorship under Pinochet to a very prosperous and apparently very unified kind of society today. Truth and reconciliation had a lot to do with that. Do you, as a Chileno, how do you describe that process and what it's resulted in? I mean, to be a unified country now, I think, is a major achievement.
Yes, and it was a painful, tortuous, and slow process. It started right after Pinochet left office, when President Aylwin in 1990 appointed a truth commission to work on gathering information on the cases of the disappeared.
Right.
There were about 3,000 cases, and the commission worked on that, and it was rejected then by the army and by a part of the political elites that was allied to the previous regime. But then, more recently, during the last part of the Lagos administration in 2005,
right.
There was another commission that handled other issues that were not handled in the first one, the cases of torture and imprisonment. And that was also a cathartic time in which finally all the truth of what had occurred under the Pinochet regime came up, and more sectors that had been denying this before joined in recognizing in a healthy way,
right.
All the atrocities that had been committed and that they needed to be faced squarely.
When I listen to you, I get two very strong points. The fact that these commissions were comprehensive in what they treated, and candor. They were honest. People apparently spoke candidly.
Yes, they spoke candidly because the commissions were appointed by the presidents, but they were formed by, very well-known people from across the political, cultural arc. And so they were, the commissions themselves were very trustworthy, very reliable, and people spoke candidly. Now, in some of these cases, what they spoke is not yet open to the public, and it will remain so, particularly with the latest report of the Commission on Torture and Imprisonment. Right. Because these commissions do not have legal consequences automatically.
Right.
The information that comes out can be dealt
They're
with
advisory in
by the courts, right? But it's very important for the sake of the health and the unity that you were pointing out in society, that society as a whole comes to terms with what happened.
Exactly so. Andrew, turning to Mexico, we, of course, another great country in Latin America, but the situation is very different here. Because in terms of elections in Mexico, we have one that's imminent in July, I believe. And right now, I think the leading candidate is the current mayor of Mexico City. It's Andrés Manuel López Obrador. And I would like to get your sense, to start us off in talking about Mexico, of what a López Obrador administration might be like. What are his politics likely to be like if he wins, which does seem likely?
It's hard to tell. The race has actually tightened a little bit in the last month, and so the person who is the candidate of Fox's party, of current president's party, has actually managed to narrow the lead. It looks like a very competitive race right now. But if Andrés Manuel López Obrador were to win the election, I think he still is the person to beat in this race. I think we would likely see a slight tilt to the left in Mexico, certainly more emphasis on social policy, probably a more nationalistic government, more looking inward at what Mexico needs to do for itself rather than looking what to do on the international stage, and probably very concerned about questions of social poverty, social policy, poverty, some of the things that have perhaps been less emphasized, though they have been worked on in the current administration, have been less emphasized in the public rhetoric.
Would that be true? This is interesting because if López Obrador wins, as you've suggested, these are the things that are likely to happen. But is a slight drift to the left possible no matter who wins, simply because of the kind of, for example, I'm thinking very strongly now of the sort of confrontational issues that are taking place between the U.S. and Mexico on a variety of subjects right now. In other words, that Mexico itself might be moving in that direction, and the candidate's going to have to respond to that no matter what party he or she comes from.
I think in terms, at least on the international stage, yes. I mean, I'm not sure if it's a shift to the left as much as a shift inward. My sense is that these 6 years, the Mexican government has really tried to reach out to the United States, tried to reach out, be part of the United Nations, the OAS, be very active in international fora. And there's a sense among many Mexicans that they didn't get what they wanted from this, that they really weren't able to get their major objective, which was achieving some sort of immigration reform in the United States, but also they didn't necessarily get much from being internationally engaged. And there's sort of a tendency to look back inward and try and re-emphasize policies that are more directed towards domestic issues than international issues. That'll never be complete. I mean, Mexico is an intermediate country. It has very strong commercial relations with the United States. Almost 1/10 of the population lives in the United States. So Mexico can't afford to not have a foreign policy, but I think there'll be less emphasis on it in terms of major priorities.
Is that sense of Mexican disappointment and perhaps the progress of relations between Mexico and the United States acute, I'm thinking in particular of the eve of September 11th, the visit of President Fox to this country, and the sense very widely shared that we were on the cusp of a brand new era, if you will, of Mexican-American relations, unlike anything we'd seen before. Is a sense in Mexico that just didn't happen?
I think there's a broad sense of disappointment. I mean, there's a sense in which the expectations were so great to begin with. I mean, there was the statement made by President Bush that Mexico was America's closest friend. And so there is a sense of disappointment that that relationship seemed to cool. On the other hand, I think there is a great sense of pragmatism among most Mexicans. Most Mexicans have relatives in the United States. They know the United States, at least through their relatives, if not directly themselves. And so there is a sense that the relationship is close, at least with the American people,
right,
at least with American culture. They know the United States in a very practical way. Mm-hmm. But there is a sense that between the governments, there were really lost opportunities, right, and the Mexicans didn't get quite what they wanted.
You know, I posed my question and sort of speculating on a Lopez Obrador victory, and I think you very helpfully told us that this race is much tighter than that. But no matter who wins in Mexico, we know that Hugo Chavez currently runs Venezuela. We've seen Evo Morales win Bolivia, and all three of us know that in this country, there's a lot of press speculation about what that means in terms of, quote, a leftist orientation in Latin America as a whole. And I'd love to get both of you to speak to that point in this way. Is that really the question? Are we posing it correctly, we as Americans? Is it a left to right issue, or is it an issue more of a response to pressures from sectors of society that are concerned about inequality and things like that? I mean, what really is going on? Is the left-right thing correct, or is it too simplistic? I'd love to hear from both of you, maybe you, Felipe, first.
I am inclined to think that it's not a left-right issue primarily. You know, in many senses, that is the result of the fact that there aren't many options really in Latin America in terms of, you know, economic orientations, policy orientations. The set has narrowed a little bit, and perhaps, you know, this is perceived by everybody, and there's a little bit of frustration with that. That there aren't many options, and the people that have been postponed for so long, particularly in those countries, feel that they want to open up a few more options, given that what has been applied so far has not delivered in terms of what they care about, which is economic improvements, decrease of inequality,
right,
access to education and health and work. You know, jobs and all that. That hasn't worked so good. So I think it's more an attempt to open up new avenues of expression, of participation, rather than left-right. I think also there's more of a sense of populism going on. And, you know, populism is a term that really comes from the Latin American experience.
Exactly.
And it's not something that has all the time gone well with left politics. It's something that hangs out there in the middle and sometimes has actually gone, you know, far to the right. So this is a new. It's wrong to describe this, I think, as a left-right dilemma.
That's very helpful, and particularly a reminder that populism is very much a Latin American tradition, if you will. Your take, Andrew?
I would say I agree with Felipe. Actually, I would say first of all that there are a few countries where there really are left parties. I mean, Chile, Uruguay, Brazil, and these have become really modern left parties, almost social democratic parties that are in power. Most of the rest of what gets characterized as left tends to be some hybrid between left parties and populism. In some cases, they are exclusively populist regimes. It's not even clear they're on the left necessarily. I think that's kind of a useful shorthand sometimes in the media, but it's not really clear that it is even left of center necessarily. And there are some countries like Mexico where there's a hybrid, where Lopez Obrador, for example, is a hybrid between sort of a populist party and a series of left parties, and it's not quite clear which direction he'll go there. And the other thing that I think is going on that's interesting is Latin America is very fragmented right now.
Yes.
And so we see sort of a rise of a left in a sense that there's sort of this current on the left, and that these are a series of governments that are stand together. But Latin America has rarely been more divided than it is right now. And there really are a series of different competing ideologies and different visions about how the country should act within the region and within the broader world.
That's very helpful. I think the last summit meeting in Mar del Plata, I believe it was last fall, suggested that there's a great deal of fragmentation. And a lot of it has to do with the breakdown of the so-called Washington consensus. Do you both? I mean, Well, the question of free trade, for example, is one in which there seem to be real divisions now in Latin American countries as to its importance to development. Do you both share that?
Yeah. I think it's both an ideological issue. I mean, some governments are more disposed towards free trade, and also a question of country size. Some countries like Brazil are simply less interested because they have large, dynamic internal markets. A lot of the smaller countries need free trade in order to continue to export some of their products.
Yeah, I think it's true that there is a lot of fragmentation right now in Latin America. So that also goes to deny the view of a homogeneous move to the left. There's a lot of diversity, a lot of fragmentation, which is negative, I think, for the region. That these countries are not pulling together in the same direction vis-a-vis the outside world, the larger world in terms of trade, in terms of policy generally. And they're like one hears about Bolivia and Morales and left resurgence there and so on. And truly, the major problems that Bolivia has are really not with the United States, but with Brazil and the neighboring countries in terms of the energy policies, the ownership of the oil companies, and so on.
Is this a region defining its voice in a sense, do you think? I mean, is there something creative about this fragmentation, or is it going to lead to disarray? You suggested you're a little bit concerned about it, Felipe, but is there any degree of optimism in what's going on now? Is there kind of a maturing of the debate among the countries there?
I think in some countries there's a degree of optimism. I would say there are situations where people who have felt excluded, and I think Bolivia is a case of this, have finally seen someone like them get elected to power. Morales is the first indigenous leader in Bolivia, and there is a sense of sort of finally ownership of the government. I think that's true other places where people have not felt that the economy has gone the direction they wanted to, and they feel they have a chance to be included finally. Now, whether those leaders are able to carry out the kind of policies that really move the economy forward, that really include people, is an open question. But I think there is a certain sense of appropriation. On the other hand, I'm also left with a feeling of a missed opportunity. And George, you commented at the beginning that in many ways the United States or Latin America feels the United States has neglected the region. That's probably true. The United States is looking elsewhere. The United States government is looking elsewhere right now. And it was an opportunity for Latin American countries to begin to develop a sense of where they wanted to take the region also, and take a stronger leadership role in the hemisphere. And I think that hasn't happened in part because of the fragmentation.
Excellent. I'd like to focus on a couple of the many key issues we could talk about that I think are very prominent, not just in the effect they have on what we're talking about here, but in terms of what Americans should be paying attention to. And let me start with you on this round of questions and answers, Felipe. When the pension system was introduced, the new pension system was introduced in Chile, it got stunning reviews in this country, as I think you know, and many suggested there were things that could be borrowed from it or taken completely from it, in that fact. Now I think it represents one of the perhaps major challenges for the incoming president, Michelle Bachelet, who we talked about earlier. If the system is facing some trouble, and I think privatization is a big element in it, what are the troubles, and what do you think her approach to solving them is going to be?
Well, I think what the government is it's not really a complete overhaul of the system as it is, but really reforming it. The system is primarily privatized already. There are some people that still contribute to the old, public system, but for a long time now, people really joined and moved on to the private system, and that system worked for a while. But the problem is that now that people are beginning to retire, you're beginning to see the problems and the gaps that have resulted in some people getting a lot of benefit from it, and some people finding that they're not going to be able to cash in on their retirement
because they don't
savings.
have enough money in it?
They don't have enough money, and also because it's a consequence of the type of labor force and labor market, in the sense that there's a lot of people that are in and out of work all the time. And what happens with those people that live a life of have employment, have unemployment?
The informal economy, so to speak.
Exactly, the informal economy or the half-formal economy. With all this labor flexibilization that goes on in market economies like that, what happens with people that are not continuously at work or who don't earn enough to really make enough? So the problems have to do with that, with evening out, with introducing a certain amounts of equality, and also on bringing in more regulations so that the private companies really bring down the rates and bring in their administrative costs and all that, and that more competition is possible.
Right.
That is one of the problems. So the reform is meant to significantly improve in the sense of equalizing more, giving opportunity to those that have been left out and behind.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's very consistent with one of the major themes I think that President Bachelet set out, and that is addressing inequality, because that seems to be at the root of, at least partially at the root of what the pension system is facing.
Yes, and I think that this has to do with, what Andrew was saying about the left, where you have structured lefts in some of these countries. I would say that the left, which is now really social democracy in a Latin American way, it's a left that the difference it makes is one that it means putting more emphasis on issues of equality in a region that is the most unequal in the world.
That's right.
So in that sense, those policies are badly necessary, needed, and they're the basis for cohesion in society.
That's very helpful, and I think one of the main points we can take from that is we here would be well advised to see a lot of leftist expression as precisely that, directed at inequality as its primary target. Andrew, we can't sit here and talk about any of these issues without bringing immigration into it. I mean, that it seems to me to be the major trans-border issue between us and Mexico right now. And with your presence, I think we have a great opportunity to get the Mexican take, if you will, on such recent developments as the President's address and then this vote, I think, in the Senate that calls for fencing the border. I mean, how are these kinds of things? How's the whole issue being talked about in Mexico these days?
I think it's being talked about on two different levels. I think in society in Mexico, among average people, I think there's a sense of hope and expectation and desire to see some progress in the immigration debate, and they tend to see the movement going on in the United States as a possibility that there might be some change in immigration laws, and that might benefit friends, family members, friends of family members in the United States. I think on the level of political elites in Mexico, people in the government, there is a mixture of wanting to stand up and defend Mexican honor against the idea of offense at the border, which feels offensive, the idea that the neighboring country would put up a fence to keep their people out, and a recognition that on the other hand, this may be a trade-off for getting some real immigration reform, and in the long term, it might be worth it. And so you see with politicians right now, a mixture. They kind of held back. They didn't really criticize Bush's speech at the beginning. Now they're starting to a little bit. They don't like the idea of the wall, but they also know that it might be a trade-off for some real change in this country.
That's extremely helpful, Andrew. There's another subject also that occurs to me right now as boiling up between these two countries in particular, maybe even affects Chile and the rest of the hemisphere. Of course, the drug issue does affect everyone. I take it, Andrew, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a major initiative now through the Mexican Parliament to liberalize those laws substantially. And the problem that American lawmakers are citing is that they feel, the Americans, that it effectively endorses or allows consumption. I mean, what's going to happen with this? This looks like a major blow up yet to come.
It is, although I think it may be contained actually. The Mexican Congress about 2 weeks ago passed, both houses of Congress passed a law which basically legalized small amounts of drug use or drug possession in return for significantly increased powers to actually combat drug trafficking. I mean, the real law was aimed at actually going after drug trafficking and really going after drug trafficking aimed at selling drugs in Mexico. But in return, they decided to get rid of some discretionary provisions and basically legalize small amounts of drugs. This was clearly could have led to a blow up in the relationship. President Fox had indicated he would sign it. He started talking to his counterparts in the United States and eventually vetoed that part of the law. And it remains to be seen how Congress will respond to it. But my sense is this was not an issue that was debated nationally very much, and probably Congress will come back and delete those provisions from the law.
Also, in thinking about the progress of democracy in the hemisphere and the stance that Latin governments can be expected to take on various issues, I don't think, and we can sit here also and ignore the presence of Cuba in what we're talking about, and particularly U.S. policy toward Cuba and how that's seen throughout the hemisphere. And I'd love to get, very briefly, both of your senses of how productive or counterproductive, or what your assessment is of the current and several decades of standing U.S. policy toward Cuba has been. Felipe?
I think that there is a majority view in Latin America, among the public and the governments, that find that the policy that the United States has conducted for all these years is wrong. It's not producing any results in terms of achieving greater opening and democracy in Cuba, which, after all, is the goal, I understand, of that policy. So it's a wrong policy for the goals that have been set out, and I think that Latin Americans view that very well and therefore have a very clear view against that position. Mm-hmm. Also, I think that, I come from Miami, you mentioned that in the introduction, and in Miami I can see that there's a lot more diversity within the Cuban American community in terms of the policies that they think the United States ought to be pursuing. Mm-hmm. I think that the policy of the United States is really captive to a dominant group, but that does not express the full range of views that there exists among the Cuban American community, as I see it in Miami.
Very helpful. Andrew, very briefly.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, with other countries like China and Vietnam, even Libya, we've reached out and tried to really nurture trade, nurture a growing civil society in those countries as a way of spurring on democratization, and we've done the opposite with Cuba. We've really closed the door with Cuba, and there's a sense that the United States is hypocritical in this relationship. The only thing I'd add to that, though, is that I think, while most of Latin American countries are disturbed by America's attitude towards Cuba, there is a sense in which some Latin Americans are also getting tired of the Cuban regime and less willing to tolerate what they see as some of the abuses of human rights. So as much as they condemn the U.S. position, they're also increasingly concerned about the future of Cuba itself.
That answer, Andrew, and things that you both have said throughout this conversation strike me that what you're both saying, and very eloquently, is that what's called for is much more sophistication on our part in terms of what's going on in Latin America. Left, right is too simplistic, and the Cuba thing, there are nuances here. Is that, I mean, just in one word, are you comfortable with that?
Oh, very much so, yes. I mean, in the sense that there is the need for more sophistication in terms of the ability to capture a much more diverse reality than is depicted in the use of 2 or 3 terms.
Exactly. You too?
I agree completely.
Well, I want to thank both of you. I think we've learned a lot in just a half hour talking to you, and I look forward to many future conversations with you, and I think it's been a benefit I know it's been a benefit to me and one to our listeners and viewers too. Thank you so much.
It was a pleasure, George.
Thank you very much.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue's also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. And please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching. Thank you both.
Thank you.